Here we go with 2 and 2. Let's work.
Hey, what's up, guys? Mark here with Todd Fossey at Combat Arts Training Academy, Mississauga. Having Todd here for a seminar today at Combat Arts, and I was having a conversation with Todd, and I really wanted to have him share his thoughts on fight IQ and how it translates to firearm, and the correlation between empty hand and firearm. So one of the things we were talking about yesterday is understanding that you have to understand your range and how to use that range and your tool accordingly. What do you think is the biggest misconception that people have with regards to that, with the firearm?
Especially when it comes to the firearm, right? The biggest misconception in the firearms training world is everything. If I'm going to be honest with you, a fight IQ in the firearms training world is virtually non-existent. So we need to take literally the principles of understanding the fight and apply it to when we have the firearm in our hand. And there are many ways that we can do that. At my school at IDS, Integrative Defense Strategies, we call it Fight IQ for CCW. And well, maybe the best place for us to start are what I call the 4 principles of winning any fight, which are distance management, timing, transitions, and dominant angles, which is almost impossible to develop versus a static, stationary cardboard paper target or steel target, right? Because you're not having any real interaction with real resistance. And so you're not coupling your decision-making, your attunement, or your self-organization with something that's inert. You can work on some kinetic skills, but you're not coupling your kinetic skills with your decision-making, whether that be tactical decision-making or that be legal decision-making. It's all about what decisions are you making, right? And so that's, I think that's maybe a good place to start. I mean, obviously we can go deeper and deeper into fight IQ, but that fight IQ translates, I think especially has to translate when you have a firearm on, because now you also have a distance weapon. But the overwhelming majority of violent crimes are happening at contact distance. So being able to manage distance and have that fight IQ is especially important. And even more importantly, because we need to have the intermediate skills. We can't just have 0 and 100, nothing or using lethal force, right? We have to have all of the other options in between, because in reality, the variables in violence are unpredictable and unrepeatable. It's not standardizable, you see? And so we have to have adaptive principles and fight IQ to be able to solve those problems that are put before us in reality, that are happening in rapid time, right? Compressed time, at extreme close distance, when the stakes are life and death and the stress levels are extremely high. So we have to have a level of unconscious competence when it comes to that.
Why do you think that there's such a big disconnect with law enforcement training with regards to that stuff?
It isn't just law enforcement training. It's the whole industry in general. Even those who do have some fight IQ who still teach firearms, they haven't integrated it with the firearm. They keep it fragmented and separate. I think there's several reasons. One, they don't know how, and they're too proud or narcissistic to admit that they don't know how to teach at that level, right? Very few instructors, 1 in a million instructors, really has an understanding of the science of skill acquisition and motor learning. So that's a big part of it. 2, live fire sells, and you can't work ecologically with real resistance with live fire. And live fire sells, and so they want what sells. They want to give the public what they want instead of give them what they need. And 2 or 3 rather, is something called system justification bias. It's a cognitive bias. And basically what that means is that when you have a culture that's in place, they want to maintain how that culture works and what the traditions are, mostly out of economics and political arrangements. And the research actually shows that even when they know that an alternative is beneficial, they'll intentionally ignore it, or they'll set out to destroy it because it's somehow a threat to the way that they've been presenting themselves or what they teach. So even though they know it's best for them and everybody else, Look it up. Anybody who's watching this, look up system justification bias and you'll see, it's not my opinion, that this is what happens. And so I'm more interested in the preservation of life than whatever the culture or the system tells us that we should be doing.
I'd love for you to explain the thought behind, because I love your shirt, don't be a gunfighter, be a fighter with a gun.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give the viewer, those who don't know you, how that philosophy came about and why?
Don't be a gunfighter, be a fighter with a gun is our slogan, as you know. And the reason, that's a very long answer. I could go on for days with that answer, but I think that the important thing to understand is how violence actually occurs. If you take a look at the data and the statistics when it comes to violent crime, the overwhelming majority of both simple assaults and aggravated assaults are happening at contact distance. And the overwhelming majority of those are ambushes where the intent of the attack is concealed until the last possible moment. So while you're carrying a firearm, the chances of you being entangled with somebody else is extremely high. The chances of someone who carries a firearm who's not law enforcement's a higher probability. I'm talking about regular citizen defenders who are not involved with gang warfare, okay? The chances of them getting into a gunfight where they're volleying and shooting back at each other is extremely low. When we take a look at, there's over 8 million aggravated assaults in the United States where people are reasonably in immediate fear of death, great bodily harm, or substantial bodily harm where they're justified to use a firearm. That's almost exclusively happening at contact distance. Now, the audience might say, well, you gotta know how to shoot too. Of course, it's like saying, you gotta know how to shoot to play basketball, of course, you know what I mean? But you gotta know how to play the rest of the game too. And so in the world of motor learning, it's called representative task design. That means that the things that we're training and practicing need to be representative of how things are, what they're actually going to be performing in reality, not some facsimile or fantastic idea about what we think it should be. Like if you're talking about military, right, they'll say, well, you gotta have a two-way range. Well, yeah, of course in the military, you're shooting at each other from distance for the most part. Law enforcement, they're having engagements versus other guns at distance, and there's lots of other contextual differences. But even for law enforcement, the overwhelming majority of the interactions that you're gonna have that are violent incorporate you having a fight with somebody else at contact distance while you're carrying a weapon. So that's why, that's the simple version, the abbreviated version of why we say, don't be a gunfighter, be a fighter with a gun.
So you made a good point outside how a lot of the interaction is going to be in close proximity. I know you do a lot of work with Coach Greg Nelson. What have you found to be, why do you feel the grappling is such an integral part to what you do with regards to retention and controlling that weapon?
It's a common question that people ask when you have a firearm on, like, why are you gonna grapple somebody? You have a firearm on. Like, what are you, stupid? You know what I mean? Well, the reality is you probably aren't gonna have a choice. I was talking about that most assaults, both simple and aggravated assaults, are ambushes that are happening at contact distance. And the research shows that, again, the overwhelming majority of those attacks involve some type of a scramble in the clinch. It makes sense, right? People are grabbing at each other, they're head fighting, they're grabbing each other's clothes, right? And there's usually some type of a scramble in the clinch. And you're usually in a confined space up against a wall or a barrier. So you have to know how to wrestle vertically, right? It's wrestling, that's in our terminology. And you have to know how to wrestle against a wall. And then the research shows, I just wrote a post about this recently, that our meta-analysis of multiple data sets and case reports indicates that when it comes to violent crimes, attacks, about 30% of them end up on the ground. And 60% of the time, the victim falls down, and 40% of the time, they're taken down against their will. And now you have a firearm on. And the fact that you have a force multiplier on you, that's a lethal force option. What that does is it changes the context, so it changes your strategy. Context dictates strategy. So you can be a grappler, but if you don't know how to grapple with that on, your strategy is going to change dramatically. Knowing how to conceal, how to retain, how to access, knowing when it's appropriate legally and how to use that option if you need to, is its own art form all unto itself. And so I mean, that's why, because that's probably where it's going to happen. So we have something called the IDS hierarchy, and you'll learn about this, but it goes concealment of my weapon and the intent with it. Concealment, retention. Retaining is a super high priority because if they know how to get it, they're going to go for it. Why? If they know you have it on, they're going to fixate on it. One, they have a predatory response where they want it. Two, they don't want you to use it on them.
Right.
And three, they want to use it on you. Right? So this is why we go concealment, retention as our top two priorities. Then our posture, our base, our stance, or whatever our frame is. Concealment, retention, posture, position, moving to the dominant position or the dominant angle. Concealment, retention, posture, position, escape. If I have a reasonable means of escape, or if I have a way that I can get off the wall or from underneath or whatever, or run away, then that's what I'm going to look to do. Concealment, retention, posture, position, escape. And if the escape isn't there, then I'm going to look to submit or incapacitate my attacker. And so we're constantly, and there's more, there's a lot more to this matrix that we've created, but it's important that we understand this, that there's real fight IQ and there's real logic to this that's tied into the legalities governing the use of force, that's tied into what's called the force sciences, which is a whole nother conversation. But when grappling is where it's at, vertically or horizontally against the wall, wherever on the ground, the better you are as a grappler, the better you're going to be everywhere else, because grappling is fight IQ at all times. So the better you know how to grapple, the better you're going to know how to be a fighter with a gun or how to fight with a gun. It's just a matter of translating those skills into a different context. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And like yesterday, Joey and I got a chance to do a private with you, and we were working on retaining the firearm on the ground and utilizing the grappling. And right away, one of the two biggest takeaways that we found was keeping that real tight and not having...
When the weapon was out of the holster.
Yes.
We call it out of holster weapon retention.
Keeping that real tight during struggle, not letting it float or have it be accessible, manipulated. And also that sometimes you're going to have to turn in a position that necessarily you wouldn't think you would want to intuitively as a jiu-jitsu practitioner.
Yeah.
Giving the back is not something you want to do, but sometimes putting yourself, you said it, between the person and the firearm away, it was a huge takeaway for me.
Yeah. There are positions when you have a firearm on that you want, that are beneficial, that you would never want in a sport grappling match. And it's not intuitive if you do a lot of sport. Like, an option is to give up your back. Obviously, I don't want to give up my back, but there are worse positions than giving up your back when you have a firearm on. And it sounds counterintuitive, but I do this a lot. I mean, a lot of pressure testing, multiple times a week at the highest levels. We're constantly workshopping and researching and developing and checking this stuff out with the top minds like Coach Nelson all the time. And so we've come to conclusions and patterns that we've recognized that are not intuitive to your average person or to your average sport grappler.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that when I went from just grappling to grappling with an edged weapon, and I totally felt brand new again now doing it with a firearm.
That's a total game changer.
Yeah, you don't know what you don't know. And I think, which leads me to my other question that I asked you today is, what do you think is best? Do you think it's best to come from a background of training, martial arts, to then using a firearm? And to my surprise, your answer was, no, it's got to be at the same time.
Ideally, you want to learn it together, because then you have to unlearn. And it takes 3 times longer to unlearn something that you've learned, because there's pathways that are already in place, strategies already in place. When you're recognizing patterns and pressures, no matter where you're at, you have trained responses, right, and reflexes. But those reflexes and pathways and patterns that you trained so far may not be conducive to when you have a weapon. In fact, it's probably not. And so this is why we want to say we want that decision making to be baked into the cake, ideally from the beginning, right? And you're coming with a blank slate. You're not coming in with a bias. You know, I just a little bit of anecdote. I train with and roll with my weapon on, a training weapon, inert training weapon, with some of the top grapplers in the world. Like literally, one of my training partners has won 12 consecutive IBJJF titles in a row. And so that's the caliber that we're talking about. And they'll intuitively think, oh, well, I'm a 3rd, 4th degree black belt. I've won 12 world titles, and so this should be pretty easy for me. And then they'll put the weapon on and they'll go, whoa, like, how are you getting my gun away from me so easily? Like, how is this so difficult for me? I'm like, because you're so good at this that it's working against something else. And also, the more dangerous things are, we found the more simple things need to be. I mean, I'll just give you a few examples. In reality, you're working on a dangerous surface. In reality, there's a 56% chance of more than one attacker. In reality, your attacker has more than one weapon, right? And you want to go for a submission? That's cool. Are you justified to use that submission? If you go for that submission, are you giving them that other person's justification and opportunity to use a weapon on you? I love it when you go for a submission when I'm training, because all you're doing is open up an opportunity and a justification for me to use my weapon on you. And there's many reasons why I say that legally. And so it's a very, very, very different game. It's not that those two games are mutually exclusive, they're not. The two can benefit from one another. Like Coach Nelson will tell you, I mentioned this the other day. He says, since I've been grappling with Todd with a gun on, I've become a better grappler. That's Greg Nelson. That's a 7th degree black belt who was the first American black belt under Pedro Sauer in 1991. And he's like, I'm a better sport grappler because I roll with a gun on. And vice versa, right? Sport grappling we discover all kinds of great concepts from sport that translate really well into what we're doing. We just have to tweak it and modify it a little bit. But really, from the 30,000 foot view, it's really the strategy. Like, I don't want to accept the ground. I want to get back to my feet as quickly as possible. I need to prioritize protecting my head and neck and weapons and monitoring arms and hands, and you need to conceal and retain in all of these positions and concepts that are just very, very different. It's called a schema model of how we look at grappling. And today and tomorrow, we're going to do a fair amount of it while we're on our feet, and maybe a little bit on the ground too.
Well, listen, Todd, I really appreciate you coming down. For those of you who haven't had a chance to come this time to this seminar, we plan on having Todd back, hopefully maybe annually. We're looking to build a relationship here. He's ahead of the curve in his field, and we recognize it, and we're looking to bring this material and this knowledge here for fellow law enforcement, officers, security, and anybody who's just looking how to look outside the standard box that we have here with regards to self-protection preservation. So, I just want to say thank you for coming and sharing the knowledge, and I'm looking forward to today's session later today.
Thank you for having me, bro. Appreciate it, brother.
All right, man.